I knew something was wrong the moment the road stopped feeling like a road and started feeling like a memory that had been erased halfway through. The Volkswagen hummed beneath me, steady but tired, its engine echoing too loudly in the open Alaskan interior, like it was nervous about being heard. The map on my phone had lost signal an hour earlier, but I kept driving anyway, following a dirt ribbon that once carried men chasing gold and now carried no one at all. The sun never fully set this far north, just sagged low and bruised the horizon with a copper glow, making time feel unreliable. That was the first lesson I ignored. Up here, daylight lies to you. My name is Aaron. I was 34 then, traveling alone in a faded blue VW Vanagon I'd rebuilt with my own hands back in Washington. The van had a personality. Every rattle meant something. Every cough of the engine had context, or at least I believed that. Belief is a powerful thing when you want solitude more than safety. I'd come north chasing silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy silence you only find where towns have died and nature has reclaimed the paperwork. Forgotten gold rush settlements scattered across the interior had always fascinated me. Places that existed because people believed in something hard enough to freeze for it. Then vanished when belief ran out. I told myself I was just camping, documenting, driving through history. But there was something else pulling me. A low-pressure ache in my chest that said if I didn't keep moving, I'd have to listen to myself. The first ghost town appeared without warning. No sign. No fence. Just a sagging wooden structure leaning into the brush like it had finally decided to rest. A collapsed roof. Rusted cans half swallowed by moss. The air smelled wrong. Not rot, not pine. Something metallic and old, like rain on forgotten tools. I parked the van near what might have once been a general store. The engine clicked as it cooled, sharp and loud in the open stillness. I waited for the echo to fade, but it didn't. Sound didn't behave normally here. It felt absorbed, flattened, like the land didn't want to give anything back. I stepped out and felt it immediately. The temperature dropped several degrees, even though the sun was still hanging there like it hadn't decided what to do. My breath fogged, thin and quick. The ground was soft, spongy with decades of decay. Every step made a sound that felt too loud, like tearing cloth. I told myself I'd just look around for an hour. Take photos, sleep in the van, leave in the morning. That was the plan I made before the quiet started to change. At first, it was just absence. No birds, no insects, no wind. Then came a sound that didn't belong. A dull rhythmic knock. Wood on wood, slow, patient. It came from somewhere deeper in the tree line, beyond the last standing cabin. I froze, listening, counting the seconds between each knock. Too deliberate to be branches, too spaced to be an animal. I laughed, actually laughed out loud. The sound felt foreign in my mouth. Probably an old beam shifting, I said to no one. My voice dropped into the air and didn't come back. I kept exploring. That was denial dressed as curiosity. Inside one of the cabins, the smell hit me like a hand over the mouth. Cold dust, mold, something sour underneath. The floorboards bowed but held. There were scratches along the inside wall, vertical and uneven, like someone had dragged metal up the wood over and over. I traced them with my fingers and felt splinters bite back. I pulled my hand away, heart tapping faster. That was when I heard my name. Not shouted, not whispered, just spoken. Flat, close. Aaron. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my footing. The cabin was empty. Light filtered in through cracks, slicing the dust into slow-moving rivers. My ears rang the way they do when you stand up too fast. I waited for the knock again. It didn't come. I told myself it was auditory memory. The brain filling space when silence goes on too long. That explanation felt scientific enough to hold for a few seconds. I walked back to the van earlier than planned. The air had grown colder again. My fingers felt stiff as I unlocked the door. Inside, the van smelled like oil, fabric, and old coffee. Familiar. Safe. I shut the door and leaned my forehead against the steering wheel, breathing until my pulse slowed. Night never arrived, but something else did. A pressure, like the land was leaning closer. I cooked dinner on the small stove, the hiss of gas sounding obscene in the quiet. Every few minutes, I stopped chewing to listen. Nothing. Then something. A footstep? No. Too heavy. Too slow. I climbed into the sleeping area and pulled the curtains closed, even though it was still light outside. The fabric glowed faintly. My body felt tired in a way sleep wouldn't fix. That was lesson number 2. Fatigue makes fear persuasive. Sometime later, the knocking returned. Closer now. Not wood on wood anymore. Metal. Hollow. The sound of something tapping the side of the van. Once. Pause. Twice. I held my breath, listening so hard my jaw ached. The tapping moved along the side panel, toward the rear. Each contact sent a vibration through the frame, small but undeniable. I reached for my flashlight and froze with my hand halfway there. Another sound joined the tapping, a dragging noise, slow, like fabric across dirt. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I counted my breaths and told myself it would stop if I ignored it. It didn't. A shadow passed across the curtain, tall and thin, distorted by the fabric. It paused near the rear window. I could smell something now. Wet, earthy, like a riverbank in spring. My stomach turned. I thought about starting the engine, about flooring it, but the fear had become complicated. What if it wasn't safe to drive? What if the road had changed the way everything else had? The tapping stopped, silence returned, thicker than before. I waited for relief. It didn't come. What came instead was understanding. The land wasn't empty. It was occupied by things that didn't need to announce themselves. That was when the rear door handle moved, not rattled, turned, slowly. The handle didn't snap back. It stayed turned, held there with a patience that felt practiced, as if whoever was on the other side understood hinges, weight, leverage. I stared at the curtain, waiting for it to slide, for the door to open, for something definitive to happen, so my fear could finally choose a shape. Nothing did. Minutes passed, or seconds. Time had softened into something pliable. My legs cramped from holding still. The smell outside lingered, seeping through the seams of the van, damp and mineral like a thawed grave. I finally forced myself to move inch by inch until my hand closed around the flashlight. The plastic felt slick with sweat. I didn't turn it on. Light would make things real, and I wasn't ready for that yet. I whispered, "Go away," and hated how small it sounded. The handle eased back into place without a sound. No footsteps followed. No retreat. Just absence again. The kind that presses in on your ears until you feel underwater. I waited another long stretch before sliding into the driver's seat. My plan was thin but necessary. Start the engine. Lights on. Drive. Simple verbs. The key trembled in my fingers. When I turned it, the engine hesitated, then caught with a familiar shudder that felt like a friend grabbing my shoulder. Headlights flared against the curtain, bleaching it white. I didn't check outside. I shifted into gear and rolled forward, slow at first, then faster as the van cleared the uneven ground. The road reappeared like a suggestion, barely wider than the van itself, framed by black spruce that leaned inward. I kept my eyes forward, jaw clenched, telling myself the danger was behind me. That was when I saw the second town. It wasn't on my map. A scatter of structures crouched low against the land, roofs intact, windows dark, too intact. The road curved through it, less inviting, inevitable. Turning around wasn't an option here. The trees pressed close, roots like knuckles under the dirt. I drove through at walking speed. The headlights skimmed across faces carved into door frames, symbols etched deep enough to last a century. The smell returned, stronger now, mixed with smoke that wasn't smoke. My skin prickled, a cold sweat breaking across my shoulders. A figure stood near what might have been a church, not moving, just there. Tall, wrapped in something that absorbed the light. I told myself it was a post, a trick of angles. My brain ran through explanations like cards, desperate to find a match. As I passed, its head turned. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove until the town fell away and the road widened enough for speed. My hands ached from gripping the wheel. When the forest finally thinned, I pulled over near a river and shut the engine off. Dawn, or something like it, had brightened the sky. Birds returned, tentative at first, then loud. I didn't sleep. I sat there listening to normal sounds, letting my body relearn what quiet was supposed to feel like. Later that day, I reached a small outpost town. Fuel. Coffee that tasted burnt and necessary. I told myself the worst was over. That night had been a single bad pocket, a mistake in routing. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Saying it out loud felt like signing something I couldn't read. But the interior has a way of following you. 2 days later, I camped again, this time near a known historical site, one with a marker and a parking area and other people's tire tracks. I met a man named Lewis, late 50s, local. He nodded at the van, said he used to have one just like it. We talked weather, roads, the way distances lie up here. I almost felt normal. Before he left, he asked where I'd been coming from. I told him the road number. His face changed, just a fraction. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "Some places don't like being remembered," and walked away. That night, the temperature dropped hard. Cold seeped up through the floor into my bones. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the river grind ice against itself. Sleep came in short, shallow bursts. Near morning, a sound pulled me back, knocking again, softer this time, almost polite. From the side panel near where I slept, my heart thudded, slower now, heavier. Fear had matured into something colder. I didn't hide. I sat up and spoke, voice steady despite myself. "I'm leaving." The knocking stopped. In its place came a voice, muffled, close enough to fog the metal. It didn't use my name this time. It said, "So did they." I didn't wait. I started the engine, packed nothing, drove until the sun climbed high and the land flattened into something readable again. I crossed the border days later, exhausted, hollowed out, carrying more than I brought. Back home, the van still rattles the same way. But sometimes, when it's quiet, I swear I hear a knock, patient and familiar, waiting for me to forget the lesson the interior taught me. Out there, the past doesn't stay buried. It listens. And if you wander far enough, it answers back. I didn't tell anyone the rest of it, not then, not later, because the rest isn't a story you tell. It's something you carry, the way cold settles into old injuries long after the weather clears. Back south, miles from the Alaskan interior, the world felt louder in ways that didn't make sense. Traffic sounded aggressive. Voices felt too close. At night, I'd wake up convinced I could smell wet earth inside my apartment, that mineral rot that didn't belong anywhere with plumbing and power lines. I checked the locks more than once, embarrassed even as I did it. Fear had changed addresses. That was all. The van sat in the driveway like it always had, paint faded, roof rack scarred from years of weather. I washed it by hand one afternoon, slow and methodical, letting routine scrub my nerves raw and clean at the same time. When I rinsed the rear panel, my hand paused over a faint mark near the handle, a smear I didn't remember making, darker than dirt. I scrubbed until my knuckles hurt and pretended the stain had never been there. Weeks passed, then months. The knock didn't come every night. That would have been easier. Instead, it arrived randomly, lightly, from inside my own head. 3 taps against memory. Once when I was half asleep, once when rain hit the window just right, once when the van cooled after a long drive and the metal ticked in that familiar way. Each time, my body reacted before my mind did, heart spiking, breath caught halfway in. I realized something then that no one warns you about. Surviving isn't the same as escaping. I tried to rationalize it the way I had up north. Stress response. Lingering adrenaline, a mind that needed to put a face on uncertainty. Those explanations worked during the day. At night, they fell apart. So I did what I'd always done when things felt wrong. I drove. Not north, never north again. I stayed on familiar routes, coastal highways, crowded campgrounds where campfire smoke and laughter braided through the trees. The van rolled steady beneath me, engine faithful, tires singing against asphalt. For a while, it helped. Fear loosened its grip, just enough to breathe. One evening in Oregon, parked near a bluff above the Pacific, I met a couple traveling in a newer VW. Early 20s, excited, full of plans. They asked about my build, about long trips, about Alaska. I told them about the beauty, the scale, the way silence can feel like a gift. I didn't tell them where not to go. That night, as fog crept up from the water and wrapped the van in damp quiet, I understood the real lesson the interior had pressed into me. It wasn't about ghost towns or old gold or things that knock in the dark. It was about respect. Some places are not empty because they were abandoned. They're empty because they were finished, used up, closed. The mistake isn't going there. It's believing that just because you arrive, you're welcome. Near dawn, I dreamed of the road again. Not the first town, not the second, a third one, deeper than either, where the buildings weren't collapsing because they were being held together by something else. In the dream, the van wouldn't start. In the dream, I finally opened the door. I woke before I could see what waited outside. After that, I changed how I traveled. Fewer detours, more questions asked at gas stations. I listened when locals hesitated before answering. I stopped treating maps like invitations and started treating them like warnings. Curiosity stayed with me, but it learned boundaries. The knocks faded slowly like echoes in a long tunnel. Not gone, just distant enough to remind me they existed. Years later, I sold the van, not because I was afraid of it, but because I needed to know the fear wasn't welded to the metal. Watching it drive away felt like closing a chapter I hadn't realized was still open. The driveway felt strangely quiet afterward. Sometimes late at night, I still think about that road, about the way daylight lied, about the figure that turned its head as I passed, about the voice that said, "So did they," like it was sharing a joke I was never meant to understand. Here's the truth I learned, the one no guidebook prints. Out there, beyond the last signal bar, the land remembers who took from it and who listened. It doesn't chase you. It doesn't need to. It waits. Patient. Certain that time will bring you back if you don't learn. I still camp. I still drive long distances alone. I still love the way a Volkswagen feels like a small, stubborn promise against a vast world. But I don't romanticize emptiness anymore. I don't confuse silence with peace. And when the night feels too quiet, when the air presses in and my instincts whisper that something isn't right, I listen. Because some knocks aren't meant to be answered. And some roads, once they stop feeling like roads, are telling you exactly what they are. Why some RV campers never return. Abandoned sites and their dark secrets. The first thing that went wrong was the silence. Because silence out there is never empty. My name is Caleb Rourke. I was 39 the year I learned that lesson for good. I grew up in western Colorado, the kind of place where open land teaches you self-reliance early and the wilderness is treated like a neighbor you respect but never fully trust. I'd been RV camping most of my adult life. Nothing flashy, just a well-maintained Volkswagen camper, old but dependable, the kind that forces you to slow down and listen to the road. I camped alone by choice. Solitude helped me think. Or at least, that's what I told myself. That trip started like dozens before it. Late October, shoulder season, when campgrounds thin out and the land feels like it's exhaling after summer. I was headed through southern Utah, cutting across a stretch of public land dotted with decommissioned campgrounds, places that no longer showed up on most maps but still existed if you knew how to look. I liked those sites. Less noise, less people. Fewer rules pretending they could control something wild. The sign for the campground was still there, barely. A sun-bleached plank nailed crooked to two rusted posts. No name anymore. Just the faint outline where letters used to be. Beyond it, a dirt road narrowed and dipped, winding into a basin of scrub and stone. I hesitated. That was my first mistake, feeling the hesitation and driving forward anyway. The air changed as soon as I crossed the threshold. Not temperature, pressure, like stepping into a room where an argument had just ended. The smell hit me next. Old ash, damp soil, something sour underneath it that I couldn't place. The campground itself was small. 6 sites, maybe 7, laid out in a loose circle. Fire rings half buried. Picnic tables splintered and gray. One vault toilet standing at the edge like a forgotten sentry. No cars, no fresh tracks, no wind. I parked at the far site, backed the VW in out of habit, and shut off the engine. The quiet rushed in so fast my ears rang. Normally, even in remote places, there's sound, wind through brush, distant birds, insects ticking like static. Here there was nothing. It made every movement feel loud. I remember closing the door too gently, like I was afraid of waking something. I told myself I was imagining it. End-of-day fatigue, the brain filling gaps with stories. I'd done this 100 times. I set up camp slowly, too slowly. I kept pausing, listening. When I walked the perimeter, my boots scuffed over old tire ruts that didn't line up with the campground layout. They cut through sites, crossed the central clearing, vanished into brush where no road should be. I knelt and touched one. Packed hard, old but not ancient. That should have been enough to leave. Instead, I cooked dinner. As the sun went down, the smell changed again. The sour note grew stronger, metallic now, like wet pennies. The temperature dropped fast, and with it came a sound I hadn't noticed before, a low, irregular tapping. Not rhythmic, not close. It drifted across the campground from different directions, like something brushing against hollow wood. I stood there with my plate cooling in my hands, counting the seconds between taps, trying to rationalize it. Branches, contracting metal, an animal testing boundaries. Denial is a powerful thing when you don't want to pack up and admit you're wrong. I ate inside the camper, lights off, curtains cracked just enough to see out. The tapping continued, joined by something else, a faint dragging sound as if something heavy was being pulled slowly across dirt. It stopped whenever I focused on it, started again when my attention drifted. My chest felt tight, but my mind kept reaching for logic. Old campground debris shifting, temperature changes, coyotes. Then I smelled smoke, not fresh. Old smoke, stirred up like ashes disturbed after a long time. It seeped into the camper through the vents. I checked the stove, cold. I leaned out the door and scanned the sights. No flames, no glow, just the moon climbing over the ridge, pale and distant, lighting up empty tables like gravestones. That was when I heard voices, low, fragmented, not words at first, just tones, human cadence without clarity. They seemed to come from the center of the campground, right where the fire pit was largest. I froze, hand on the door frame, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I whispered, "Hello," before I could stop myself. The voices stopped instantly. The silence that followed was worse than before. It pressed in, heavy, expectant. I closed the door and locked it, feeling foolish for doing it so quietly. I sat on the edge of the bed, every sense stretched thin. Minutes passed, maybe more. My phone had no signal, and I didn't want to turn it on anyway. Light felt like an invitation. Something brushed the side of the camper. Just once. A soft scrape along the metal panel near the rear wheel. I held my breath. Another scrape followed, longer this time, slow and deliberate. Whatever it was moving along the side, feeling its way forward. I pictured an animal, bear maybe, but the motion was wrong, too controlled, too exploratory. Then came the knock, 3 taps, knuckle hard, on the side door. I didn't move. Couldn't. My mind split in two, one part screaming to respond, to assert myself, to make it human, the other part begging me to stay silent, to disappear into the dark. The knock came again, louder, closer to the window now. A voice followed, clearer this time. "Hey, you okay in there?" It sounded wrong, flat, like someone reciting concern instead of feeling it. The words were right, but the spaces between them were off, stretched just a fraction too long. I leaned closer to the curtain, heart hammering, and saw a shape standing outside. Tall. Still. Just beyond the glass, close enough that I could make out the outline of a head tilted slightly, as if listening for my breathing. I thought about the tire tracks, the abandoned sites, the smell, all the things I'd ignored because leaving would have meant admitting fear. The voice spoke again, closer now, right by the window. "Open up. It's not safe out here." That was when panic finally broke through denial, sharp and undeniable. My hands shook as I reached for the keys, my mind racing through escape routes, wondering if the engine would turn over, if whatever was outside would move when I did. The smell of smoke thickened, and beneath it, something else. Rot, sweet and sickening. The knock came a third time, harder than before, rattling the glass. And I realized with cold certainty that whatever was outside had been waiting for me to answer, not to help, but to be invited in. I stayed frozen there, keys clenched in my fist, listening to the thing outside breathe and understanding too late why some RV campers never return from abandoned sites like this one. I stayed absolutely still, the keys biting into my palm hard enough to ground me, and the thing outside stayed still too, as if it could sense movement through the metal skin of the camper. That was when I noticed the breathing wasn't coming from just one place. There was the faint rasp right by the window, slow and measured, but underneath it, barely audible, were other breaths, scattered, irregular, coming from different parts of the campground. Close. Too close. Denial tried one last time to save me. I told myself there were other campers I hadn't seen, late arrivals, people messing with me. But the words felt thin even in my own head. The air inside the VW had gone stale and hot, carrying that layered smell of smoke and decay. My chest ached from holding my breath. The voice came again, softer now, almost coaxing. You don't want to stay locked up all night. Things walk through here after dark. That did it. Not the threat, there wasn't one, but the familiarity. The way it spoke like it knew the place, like it had watched people make this decision before. I twisted the key in the ignition and the engine coughed, loud in the silence, then caught. The sound should have been reassuring. Instead, it felt like I'd just announced myself. The shape outside the window shifted. I caught a glimpse of movement reflected in the glass, an arm lifting, bending wrong at the elbow, too loose, like it wasn't used to the joint. The knocking stopped, replaced by something scraping along the side of the camper as I threw it into reverse. The tires spun briefly in loose dirt, then grabbed. I backed hard, not caring about noise now, steering blind by instinct. Figures emerged from the dark, not rushing, not chasing, just stepping into view as the headlights swung across the campground. There were 3 of them I could see clearly, maybe more beyond the reach of the beams. They stood at the edges of the sites, near fire rings and tables, positioned like they'd always belonged there. Their clothes were wrong, layers that didn't match the weather, jackets too heavy, fabric hanging stiff and uneven, as if it had been worn wet and never dried properly. Their faces, I didn't linger long enough to study them. Something about the way their features caught the light made my eyes slide away, like trying to focus on a reflection in moving water. One of them raised a hand, not a wave, more like a signal. I gunned it. The dirt road out was narrower than I remembered, twisting tighter as panic tunneled my vision. Branches clawed at the sides of the camper, the sound sharp and screeching, and for a terrifying second I thought I felt weight shift onto the rear bumper. The engine strained, but it kept pulling. In the mirror, the campground vanished behind a bend, swallowed by darkness as if it had never been there. I didn't stop until the road widened and the tires hit pavement. Even then, I drove another 20 miles before pulling over, hands shaking so badly I had to sit on them. The smell lingered long after, smoke and rot clinging to the upholstery, my clothes, my hair. I slept with the lights on that night at a crowded rest stop, surrounded by idling semis and the low hum of human activity, and still I dreamed of tapping sounds and voices that knew my name. I told myself it was over. It wasn't. Over the next few days, small things started happening. The camper door would be unlocked in the morning when I knew I'd locked it. My radio would crackle to life at night, picking up fragments of speech that dissolved into static when I focused on them. Once, at a gas station in Nevada, I caught a whiff of that same sour smoke and nearly dropped to my knees. I cut the trip short, headed home earlier than planned. I didn't talk about what happened, not to friends, not to family. I buried it under routine and daylight and the comfort of familiar roads. For a while that worked. Then the letter started coming. No return address, just my name, written carefully like someone practicing it. Inside, a single sentence each time, printed in block letters that pressed hard into the paper. You left your fire going. Some places don't forget. The ground remembers who sleeps on it. I burned the first one, tore the others up, and flushed them down the toilet. I told myself it was a prank, someone who'd seen my plates, tracked me down. But deep down, I knew better. I'd felt it at that campground, the way the land itself seemed attentive, waiting, like I'd stepped into a story already in progress and wandered off with a piece of it clinging to me. Months passed, the letters stopped, the smells faded, life resumed its shape. I even took the camper out again, sticking to well-lit, well-used sites. I thought maybe I'd paid whatever price was required. Then, late one night, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. When I did, there was a pause on the line, filled with soft static and something like distant wind. "Hey," the voice said. Flat. Familiar. "You okay in there?" My blood ran cold. I hung up and turned the phone off, heart hammering, every instinct screaming. I didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, I loaded the camper with shaking hands and drove it straight to a dealer. Sold it cheap. Didn't negotiate. Didn't look back. I don't camp anymore. But I pay attention now. When I pass old campgrounds, decommissioned sites, places scrubbed from maps but still marked by fire rings and worn earth, I slow down. I watch the tree line. I listen. And sometimes, just sometimes, I see new tire tracks cutting through places no road should be, leading into silence. Here's what I learned, and it's why I'm telling you this. Some campgrounds aren't abandoned because people stopped coming. They're abandoned because something learned how to wait. And if you ignore that feeling, the hesitation, the pressure, the quiet that doesn't feel empty, you don't just risk a bad night. You risk being remembered by a place that doesn't let go. I thought selling the camper would sever the connection. I thought distance and time would thin whatever thread I'd brushed against out there. That assumption lasted exactly 1 year. It started quietly, the way real trouble always does. I began noticing abandoned places everywhere. Empty pullouts, closed campgrounds, forgotten picnic areas tucked just off the highway. Places I'd driven past for decades without a second glance now pulled at my attention like magnets. I'd catch myself slowing down, turning my head, feeling that same pressure in my chest I'd felt the night in Utah. Not curiosity, recognition. I told myself it was memory. Trauma has a way of sharpening certain edges of the world, but memory doesn't explain why my dreams changed. I began dreaming of campsites I'd never visited. Fire rings still warm. Folding chairs knocked over as if someone had stood up too fast. I'd hear voices just out of frame, always speaking in that same flattened tone, always saying ordinary things. "Did you bring the cooler? It's going to get cold tonight. Someone should lock the door." I would wake with the smell of old smoke in my nose and dirt under my fingernails. I stopped sleeping well, started drinking more coffee, avoided long drives. Then one afternoon, while cutting through a rural stretch of Arizona on my way to visit my sister, I saw the sign. Same shape, same weathered plank. No name. I slammed on the brakes before I realized what I was doing. The road curved away from it, but the sign stood there, angled slightly toward me, as if positioned for visibility, for invitation. I sat there longer than I want to admit, hands gripping the wheel, pulse loud in my ears. Every rational part of me screamed to keep driving, to not even acknowledge it. But another part, the part that had listened to the tapping, that had smelled the smoke, felt something else. Obligation. That was the most terrifying realization of all. Not fear, responsibility. As if by leaving that first site, I'd interrupted something unfinished, and now the land itself was nudging me to correct it. I drove on, but the feeling didn't leave. Over the following weeks, the world seemed to thin around the edges. Sounds carried too far. Smells lingered too long. Once, standing in line at a grocery store, I heard a voice behind me say, "You don't want to stay locked up all night." And I nearly broke a display trying to get away. When I turned, it was just a man on his phone, laughing at something I couldn't hear. I finally did the one thing I'd been avoiding: research. Not online, not forums. Those were full of noise and fiction. I went to county offices, local libraries, historical societies, and towns near the places that stuck with me. I asked about decommissioned campgrounds. about sites that closed quietly without incident reports or press releases. The answers followed a pattern. They just stopped using it. Maintenance costs. No official reason. People didn't feel comfortable there. One archivist, an older woman with sharp eyes and a voice worn thin by decades of dust, finally said what no one else would. Some land doesn't like being temporary. She explained it slowly, carefully, as if choosing words was a kind of protection. Certain places, she said, especially those used over and over by people passing through, develop a sort of memory, not supernatural in the movie sense, more like habit, expectation. When campers come, they bring routines, fires at dusk, voices at night, movement in the dark. Over time, the land learns those rhythms, and when people stop coming abruptly, when a place is abandoned instead of eased out of use, the expectation remains. It keeps setting the table, she said, even when no one shows up. I asked her about the voices, the knocking, the feeling of being watched. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she asked me if I'd responded when it called to me. I left without saying goodbye. For a while after that, things escalated. The calls returned. Not often, but enough, always from different numbers, always the same voice. Sometimes it would just breathe. Other times it would describe ordinary campground details with unsettling precision. You parked crooked. You left the cooler outside. You should have put the fire out all the way. I stopped answering. Then one evening I found a map on my kitchen table. I lived alone. The doors were locked, the windows were closed. The map was old, creased, and stained, with hand-drawn markings circling places I recognized immediately. Decommissioned sites, abandoned pullouts, forgotten campgrounds. One circle was fresh, around my town. That was the moment fear shifted into something else. Resolve, maybe, or anger. I was tired of being followed by echoes. Tired of living like I'd trespassed somewhere I could never leave. I decided to go back. Not to that first campground, to another one on the map, closer, easier to reach. A site that had closed years ago after a series of unexplained incidents, missing gear, abandoned vehicles, campers who left in the middle of the night without their belongings. I borrowed a friend's SUV, packed carefully, deliberately, and drove out just before sunset. The site was quiet when I arrived. Not empty, quiet. The kind of quiet that feels arranged. The fire rings were intact, the tables upright, everything waiting. I parked at the edge and stepped out, heart pounding but steady. I know you're here, I said aloud, my voice sounding small against the trees, and I'm not staying. The air felt heavier immediately. The temperature dropped. The smell came back, thick and unmistakable. I didn't wait for a response. I gathered deadwood, built a fire in the central ring, and lit it as the sun disappeared. The flames took fast. I stayed with that fire until it burned low, until the light shrank and shadows stretched. When it was nothing but embers, I poured water over it, slowly, thoroughly. I stirred the ashes with a stick until steam rose and the smell changed from smoke to wet earth. I'm closing this, I said, though my voice shook. I'm not yours. The tapping started then, all around me, from trees, from tables, from the ground itself. Voices rose, overlapping, fragments of conversations that never finished. Panic surged, but I stayed where I was, dousing the last of the embers, refusing to run. When the fire was dead, truly dead, the sounds stopped. The silence that followed was different. Not expectant. Released. I didn't wait. I got back in the car and drove until dawn. The calls stopped after that. The dreams faded, the smells never returned. I don't know if what I did worked everywhere or just for me. I don't know if those places need closure or witnesses or simply respect. What I do know is this: abandoned campgrounds aren't empty, they are paused. And when you step into one, you become part of whatever story it's still trying to finish. So if you camp, especially in an RV, listen to your instincts. If a place feels wrong, leave. If a site looks untouched but feels watched, don't unpack. And never, ever ignore the silence when it feels like it's waiting for you to speak. Because some places don't want visitors. They want continuity. And once they learn your voice, they may not let you forget it. I thought that was the end of it. For a long time, it was. Years passed, real years, measured by ordinary things, work deadlines, birthdays I almost forgot, the slow creak of my knees when I stood up too fast. I moved closer to town. I stopped taking back roads. I learned how to live without chasing quiet. And for the most part, the world let me. But fear doesn't always come back as fear. Sometimes it returns as responsibility. I started noticing patterns in the news, small items buried low on local pages, an RV found abandoned at a closed site, a family who left a campground in the middle of the night and couldn't explain why, a solo camper whose phone was recovered, still recording audio, nothing but wind and a soft, repetitive tapping. The details were never sensational. They didn't need to be. I recognized the shape of the story every time. I told myself it wasn't my problem, that I'd done what I needed to do to survive. But the older I got, the harder that lie was to maintain. Because I remembered how close I'd come to answering the knock, how easy it would have been to open that door and become just another unexplained absence. The first time I intervened, I didn't plan to. I was driving through New Mexico at dusk, traffic thin, sky bruised purple and gold, when I saw an RV pulled off near an old access road. A young couple stood beside it, arguing quietly. I almost passed them. Almost. Then I saw the sign behind them, half-buried, sun-bleached, no name. I pulled over. They looked relieved when I approached, the way people do when they think help has arrived. They said they'd planned to stay the night, that the campground looked fine, just quiet. Too quiet, the woman added, laughing nervously. I didn't tell them my whole story. I didn't need to. I told them the site was closed for a reason. I told them the land floods at night, that animals move through there, that it wasn't safe. All of that was technically true, just not complete. They hesitated, caught between politeness and instinct. Then the wind shifted, and I saw it happen, the moment their bodies understood something their minds hadn't yet caught up to. The smell reached them. Old smoke, damp ash. They didn't argue after that. They left. I watched their taillights disappear back onto the highway before I drove away myself, heart pounding, hands steady. I slept better that night than I had in years. After that, I paid attention. Whenever my routes took me near abandoned sites, I slowed down. I watched for parked vehicles, tents half-pitched, people convincing themselves they were just being silly. Sometimes all it took was a word. Other times I had to stay longer, talk more, give them reasons that fit neatly into daylight logic. I never mentioned voices, never mentioned knocks. I learned something important in the process. The land doesn't always fight you when you interfere. Sometimes it feels almost relieved, like pressure easing, like a story being redirected before it reaches its worst ending. But not always. There was one site in Northern California where the air turned hostile the moment I stepped out of my truck. The tapping started immediately. The temperature dropped hard enough to raise goosebumps. I didn't stay long. I didn't try to fix that one. I drove away with my jaw clenched, knowing some places are too far gone to negotiate with. That's another lesson people don't talk about. Not every place can be saved. Some campgrounds were abandoned because something crossed a line, because too many routines piled up without resolution, because too many people came and went without closing the loop. Fires left smoldering, stories unfinished, fear ignored just long enough to be claimed. Those places don't want company. They want permanence, and they will try to teach you how to stay. I'm older now, slower. I don't chase these sites the way I once did. I don't believe I'm fixing anything on a grand scale. I'm just paying attention, offering warnings where I can, choosing not to look away. Because the truth is, RV camping in America was never about conquering the land. It was about moving through it respectfully, understanding that you're a guest, even when you bring your own walls and locks with you. When that respect slips, when convenience replaces awareness, places notice. The road teaches you that if you listen long enough. So if you're out there, planning your next trip, scrolling past reviews, spotting a quiet little campground no one seems to use anymore, let me leave you with this. Not as a threat, not as folklore, but as hard-earned advice. Pay attention to what your senses tell you before your logic catches up. Smells don't lie. Silence has texture. And if a place feels like it's holding its breath when you arrive, that's not coincidence. It's expectation. Pack up. Drive on. Find somewhere that welcomes passing through instead of demanding you stay. Because some RV campers never return not because they were careless, but because they mistook abandonment for emptiness. And the land, patient as it is, corrected them. The first night the Ozarks went quiet around my Volkswagen, I realized silence could be louder than any engine I had ever trusted. I was 34 then, driving a weather-beaten VW Westphalia named Willow, the kind of van that carried old road dust in its seams and listened better than most people I knew. I had driven down from Missouri's flatter heartland toward the folded hills of northern Arkansas, chasing a promise I had made to myself after a long year of unfinished grief and unfinished sentences. The Ozarks felt like a place where the land still remembered things humans preferred to forget. That was the reason I came. That and the trails no one talked about unless they were already there. My plan was simple. 3 nights on a secluded RV trail tucked between limestone ridges and hardwood forest, a place recommended by a mechanic in Springfield named Marcus, 58, local, missing 2 fingers and most of his patience. He told me not to trust the maps, told me the roads had opinions, and told me that if I heard anything walking upright outside my van at night, I should not open the door no matter how polite it sounded. He laughed when he said it, but he didn't smile. I arrived late afternoon, the sun pouring gold through oak leaves, the air thick with damp earth and something mineral beneath it. The campground was unofficial, barely marked, just a gravel loop, and a few primitive clearings where people like me preferred to disappear for a while. No hookups, no office, no cheerful signs. Only a rusted post with a hand-painted warning about flash floods and bears, the paint peeling like tired skin. There were 2 other campers when I pulled in, a couple from Oklahoma, Leah and Brian, early 40s, towing a small Airstream. Brian nodded once, the universal greeting of men who had learned not to ask questions in places like this. Leah smiled longer than necessary. They had been there since morning, she said, and the quiet was something else. The way she said it made the words heavier than they should have been. The 3rd camper was a local named Everett, mid-60s, gray beard like wire, parked further down the loop in a faded Class C RV that looked like it had stopped caring decades ago. He did not introduce himself. He only looked at Willow, then at me, then at the tree line behind me, as if counting something that had not yet arrived. I set up before dark. Pop top up, stove tested, flashlight charged. The forest breathed around me. Cicadas wound up their mechanical prayers. Somewhere far off, water moved over rock. It all felt normal enough to justify my stubborn optimism. I cooked a simple meal, sat on the step of my van, and watched the light drain out of the hills like blood leaving a limb. When night settled, it did not arrive all at once. It crept. The cicadas cut out in patches, then resumed, then stopped again. The air cooled fast, carrying a smell like wet fur and crushed leaves. I noticed it then, the way sound did not travel the way it should have. My voice felt swallowed when I hummed to myself. The clink of my mug sounded closer than it was. The forest seemed to lean inward, compressing the space. I told myself this was what I came for. Discomfort, attention, a reminder that the world was larger than my thoughts. The first sound came just after 10, a knock, soft but deliberate, from somewhere to the left of my van, not on metal, on wood. I froze with my hand on the zipper of the screen. Another knock followed, same rhythm, same spacing, 3 beats. Pause, 3 beats. It reminded me of someone testing a door in a polite house. I waited. The knock did not repeat. I listened for footsteps, for voices, for the shuffle of a curious animal. Nothing. The forest held its breath. When sound returned, it did so reluctantly. A single owl call, then silence again. I did not open the door. Sleep came in fragments. I dreamed of driving roads that bent backward, of headlights illuminating faces that vanished when I tried to focus. At some point, I woke to the smell again, stronger now, wet fur, iron. The kind of scent that sticks to the back of your throat. I lay still, counting my breaths, listening. Something moved outside. Slow, deliberate. Not heavy enough to be a bear, not light enough to be a deer. The steps circled my van once, close enough that I could feel vibration through the floor. When it stopped near the sliding door, my chest tightened with the knowledge that whatever it was, it knew where I was. A sound came then, not a voice exactly, but shaped like one. A low exhale that rose and fell with the wrong rhythm. I thought of Marcus and his missing fingers, of the way he laughed without smiling. I thought of all the times I had ignored my instincts because I wanted a better story than the truth. The sound moved away eventually. Dawn found me sitting upright, eyes burning, the van cold around me. Nothing looked disturbed, no prints I could see, no marks, only the smell lingered, faint but undeniable, woven into the morning damp. Leah came by mid-morning with coffee, her eyes shadowed. She asked if I had slept. I lied. She nodded like she expected it. Brian stayed by their Airstream, pretending to fix something that did not need fixing. Everett was gone. His spot was empty, the gravel untouched, as if he had never been there at all. We talked about weather and roads and nothing else. The unspoken hung between us, thick as fog. When Leah finally said they were leaving early, I understood it was not a suggestion. It was a warning dressed as politeness. I stayed. By afternoon, the forest felt watchful. The smell returned in waves, stronger near the tree line, fading when I stood in the open. I took a short hike to steady my nerves, following a narrow trail that dipped into a hollow where the temperature dropped 10 degrees in a few steps. The air down there tasted old. The ground was soft, pocked with impressions that did not match any tracks I knew. Long, deep, almost human but stretched. I turned back. That evening, the quiet arrived earlier, too early. The cicadas never started. The woods skipped the usual rituals and went straight to stillness. As darkness settled, I heard it again. The knock, this time on metal. My van's rear panel rang softly once, twice, 3 times. Pause, 3 times. Then a voice, clearer now, shaped around my name. It was spoken gently, as if by someone who cared whether I answered. I did not. The voice tried again, closer, the words slurred at the edges like they had been learned from listening rather than speaking. My heart hammered so hard I worried it would give me away. I thought about opening the door just enough to tell whoever it was to leave. I thought about how many stories begin that way and do not end at all. Outside, something shifted its weight. Nails scraped lightly against metal. Testing. The smell surged, filling the van, making my eyes water. Panic rose fast then, hot and sharp, drowning reason. I reached for my keys, my flashlight, my phone, anything that felt like control. The voice stopped. In its place came a sound like laughter that had forgotten how to be human. I stayed still until my muscles ached, until the forest finally exhaled and sound crept back in, piece by piece. When dawn came, it found me older, quieter, and no longer pretending this place was interested in my courage. I had come to the Ozarks to unmask legends, to prove to myself that fear was only a story we told when we did not understand the dark. Standing there in the gray light, the smell still clinging to Willow's curtains, I realized something else had been watching me decide what I believed. And it was patient. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, I knew leaving immediately would feel like running, and staying without understanding would feel worse. I told myself I needed daylight answers, the kind you could point to and measure, even if they never fully explained the night. Willow seemed to agree, her old engine ticking as it cooled, as if reminding me that motion was still possible. I walked the loop slowly, scanning gravel and soil the way you do when you want proof, but are afraid of what it might look like. Near the rear of my van, the dirt held shallow impressions, elongated and uneven, pressed in at angles that suggested weight carried forward, not down. They faded quickly, dissolving into leaf litter, as if whatever made them understood how easily tracks tell stories humans are not ready to hear. I followed them toward the trees until the smell thickened again, he said, metallic and animal, and the forest floor dipped into another hollow. The temperature dropped sharply, my breath fogging despite the rising sun. That was where I found the scrap of fabric caught on a thorn bush. Flannel, red and black, torn clean through. Too clean. Everett wore flannel. The realization landed softly but stayed. I looked around, half expecting him to step out from behind a trunk and laugh, to tell me locals like to mess with outsiders. No laughter came. Only the low hum of insects returning, cautious as if checking whether it was safe to resume their lives. Back at my van, I tried to convince myself the scrap meant nothing. Campgrounds collect lost things. Stories grow teeth when you feed them. Still, I packed my gear tighter than necessary, checked my phone for service that did not exist, and scribbled notes in the journal I kept for road thoughts. Writing grounded me. Words had edges. They stayed where you put them. Around noon, a ranger truck rolled slowly down the gravel road, dust blooming behind it. The driver was a woman in her early 30s, name tag reading Kendra, local, polite in the way people are when they already know something you do not. She asked if everything was okay, eyes moving over Willow, over me, over the tree line. I hesitated, then told her about the noises. Not the voice, not my name, just the knocking, the smell. Her expression did not change much, but her jaw tightened. Bears, she said eventually, and pranksters. This area gets both. I asked about Everett, about the Class C that had been parked down the loop. She looked back toward the empty site, then at me again. No one registered that rig, she said. Haven't seen it before. She advised me to keep food sealed, to make noise if I hiked, to leave if I felt unsafe. The words were standard. The way she avoided my eyes was not. Before she left, she added, "Some trails don't like being alone at night." Then she smiled like it was a joke and drove off. The afternoon dragged. Clouds gathered, bruised and heavy, pressing the air flat. I tried to nap, but every creak of the van pulled me back to alertness. When rain finally came, it did so in a sudden, violent burst, drumming on the roof, turning the ground slick. The smell intensified with the moisture, rising from the earth like a memory stirred. As evening approached, I debated leaving. The road out was rough but passable. I could be on pavement before dark. Instead, I cooked dinner, ate mechanically, and told myself one more night would give me closure. The lie tasted bitter. Darkness fell fast under the clouds. Rain tapered to a mist, then stopped. The forest went still again, skipping the usual chorus. I sat inside Willow with the lights off, listening to my own pulse, the drip of water from leaves. When the first knock came, I did not jump. I closed my eyes and breathed. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. This time it came from the passenger side. The metal vibrated softly. I waited. The knock repeated, closer, more insistent. Then the smell flooded in, so strong it made my stomach twist. A sound followed, low and coaxing. Not words, a cadence, like someone humming a tune they half remembered. It moved along the length of the van, fingers dragging lightly, nails tracing seams. I thought of how Willow listened better than people. I wondered what she heard now. The humming stopped at the sliding door. Something leaned in, close enough that I felt heat through the metal. A whisper came then, breathy, wet. "I know you're in there." My name followed, pronounced correctly, softly, like an apology. Panic surged, bright and blinding. My hand hovered over the door handle before my mind caught up. Every instinct screamed to answer, to confront, to end the waiting. Another voice, quieter but firmer, reminded me of every story that ended badly because someone wanted certainty more than safety. I backed away, slow, until my shoulders hit the cabinets. Outside, the thing exhaled sharply, frustrated. The sound shifted, dropping lower, vibrating through the van's frame. Nails raked hard then, leaving lines I could hear but not see. The van rocked once, twice, not enough to tip, but enough to test. I grabbed my keys and turned the ignition. The engine coughed, then caught, the sudden noise tearing through the quiet. Outside, something retreated fast, crashing through brush with an awkward, loping gait that did not match any animal I knew. I did not wait. I slammed the van into gear and rolled forward, gravel spraying, headlights carving tunnels through trees. As I rounded the loop, something crossed the beam ahead of me. Tall. Too tall. It moved on two legs, but the proportions were wrong. Arms swinging too long, my head set too low. Its skin looked mottled, pale against the dark, and when it turned, the reflection from my lights caught eyes set wider apart than they should have been. I did not stop. The road out-twisted, narrow and slick. Branches scraped the sides of the van. My hands shook on the wheel. Behind me, something kept pace for a few seconds, crashing through undergrowth, then fell back. I drove until the trees thinned and the smell faded, until the world widened and the fear had room to breathe. I pulled over miles later, engine idling, and sobbed into the steering wheel, the release sudden and ugly. When I finally slept, it was with the doors locked, the lights on, and the road humming beneath me. Morning found me at a diner on the edge of a small town, coffee cooling untouched. I replayed the night in fragments, testing each one for exaggeration. The scratches on Willow's side settled the argument. Long, parallel lines scored through paint, too even to be branches, too high to be animals that walked on four legs. A man at the counter noticed my stare and followed it outside. He was older, 70s maybe, local by the way he claimed space. He nodded once, slow. "Ozarks will do that," he said. "They keep what they like." I asked him about legends, about things that walked upright and borrowed voices. He listened, then shrugged. "Names don't help," he said. "Listening does." I left the area that day, driving west until the hills softened and the air changed. Willow carried the marks like scars, reminders etched into metal. I learned to trust the first unease, the quiet before the knock. I learned that some places are not empty when they feel that way. They are simply waiting. And when I camp now, when the forest leans in and the night tests my doors, I remember the Ozarks and the way fear can be a teacher if you let it speak first. The first thing I learned that night was that forests do not go quiet by accident. My name is Elias Moore. I was 37 when this happened, old enough to trust my instincts, and still young enough to talk myself out of them. I grew up in Western Oregon, raised on logging roads and rain-soaked campsites, and by the time I bought my faded green Volkswagen Vanagon, camping wasn't a hobby, it was muscle memory. The van had carried me through desert heat, coastal storms, and mountain passes that made lesser vehicles beg for mercy. I trusted it the way some people trust a good dog. When I parked somewhere remote, I believed I belonged there. That belief is what took me deep into the Cascades, following a stretch of Forest Service road that didn't show up clearly on my GPS. I was looking for solitude, the kind that clears your head. I'd been coming off a rough year, divorce finalized, job downsized, friendships thinning out the way they do when people settle into different versions of adulthood. I told myself I wasn't running from anything. I was just going somewhere quiet enough to hear myself think. The campground was barely a campground at all. No ranger station, no check-in board, just a widening in the trees, a half circle of fire rings, and a pit toilet that looked like it hadn't been serviced since the last administration. The air smelled of wet bark and old leaves, layered with something faintly metallic underneath. Evening was already folding itself into the forest when I rolled in. The sun caught high in the branches like it didn't want to leave. There were 3 other vehicles scattered across the clearing. A pickup with a roof tent, an SUV with out-of-state plates, and something that made me pause. A second Volkswagen van, beige, older than mine, curtains drawn tight. That should have felt comforting. Instead, it gave me the strange sense that I'd arrived late to a conversation I couldn't hear. I parked, killed the engine, and sat there longer than I meant to. The forest pressed in close, trunks rising like columns in a ruined cathedral. Sound behaved oddly. Every footstep echoed too long. Every rustle felt deliberate. I told myself that was just the acoustics of dense trees. I'd said that to myself 100 times before. I made camp quickly. Pop top up, stove checked, headlamp hung from the rear hatch. The routine was a way to keep my hands busy while my mind cataloged small things I didn't like. No birds, no insects. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was expectant. As darkness settled, I noticed movement near the pit toilet. A figure tall and thin standing just beyond the reach of my lantern light. I called out a casual greeting, the way campers do, half friendly, half claiming space. No answer. The figure moved, not away but sideways, slipping behind a tree and vanishing without sound. I laughed it off quietly. People keep to themselves out here. That's the point. Later, as I sat inside the van eating straight from the pan, I heard knocking. It wasn't loud. 3 soft taps spaced evenly coming from the driver's side panel. My first thought was branch against metal. My second was animal. My third thought, the one I didn't like, was that it sounded intentional. I waited. Counted my breaths. Nothing else followed. I cracked the door just enough to shine my flashlight out. The beam cut across ferns and roots, caught the edge of the fire ring, and stopped at the base of a tree. No one there. No branches close enough to reach the van. I closed the door and locked it. That should have been enough. Sometime after midnight, the forest found its voice again. Not all at once. One sound at a time. A distant call that might have been an owl, except it repeated too slowly. The crunch of footsteps that never quite got close enough to place. And underneath it all, a low hum, almost like wind through a tunnel, except there was no wind. That was when I noticed the smell had changed. The clean dampness of pine and soil was gone, replaced by something sour and animal, like wet fur left too long in a closed space. I checked the van, convinced something had crawled underneath. Nothing. The smell wasn't coming from any one direction. It was just there. Around 2 a.m, headlights swept across the trees. I watched from my rear window as the SUV started up, engine revving too hard, too fast. Someone shouted, one sharp word I couldn't make out. Doors slammed. The vehicle tore down the service road, gravel spitting into the dark. No goodbyes. No explanation. I waited for the pickup to do the same. It didn't. The beige Volkswagen was still there, too. Curtains still drawn. No light. No movement. That's when I heard crying. It was faint, far enough away that I couldn't tell direction. High and broken, the sound of someone trying not to be heard. Every part of me wanted to believe it was an animal. Foxes make awful noises. So do cougars. I repeated that like a mantra while my hands shook. The crying stopped as suddenly as it started. Minutes passed, maybe more. Time didn't behave normally anymore. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the clearing. I counted them without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2, 3. Always the same rhythm. Never closer than the edge of the light. Never far enough to fade. I turned off my lantern. Darkness pressed against the windows, thick and intimate. In the reflection of the glass, I saw my own face pale and drawn, eyes too wide. I thought about the other campers, about the SUV that fled, about the van that hadn't moved once since I arrived. The footsteps stopped near the beige Volkswagen. There was a long moment, so long my ears rang with silence, and then a sound I will never forget. Knocking, not on my van, on theirs, hard, urgent, over and over again. No one answered. I stayed frozen, breath shallow, listening as the knocking slowed, then stopped. I waited for an engine to turn over, a door to open, anything. Instead, I heard fabric shift, curtains being pulled aside. A shape moved inside that van, silhouetted faintly against the moonlight. It didn't look like someone waking up. It looked like someone standing perfectly still, already awake, waiting. That was the moment my rationalizations began to collapse. This wasn't just a strange night. Something was wrong with this place, and whatever it was had noticed me. I reached for my keys, every sound inside the van suddenly deafening. As I slid into the driver's seat, the crying started again. Closer this time, coming from the trees behind me, and layered beneath it was something else. A breath. Slow, controlled. Right outside the van. I didn't look. I turned the key. The engine hesitated just for a fraction of a second, and in that space between silence and ignition, something knocked on my rear door from the inside. The knock came again, harder this time, metal flexing inward with a dull thud that I felt through the seat before I heard it. My engine caught finally, a rough idle rattling through the frame of the van like a nervous tremor. I slammed the headlights on, and the clearing exploded into harsh white light. Trees casting long, warped shadows, the fire rings empty, the ground torn up with footprints that hadn't been there before. The rear door shook once more, then went still. I didn't think. Thinking was too slow. I threw the van into gear and lurched forward, tires spinning in loose gravel. As I swung wide to avoid the picnic table, my headlights swept across the beige Volkswagen. Its side door was open now, hanging at an angle that made my stomach drop. The interior was dark, impossibly dark, like the light refused to settle there. For a split second, I saw movement inside, not someone climbing out, but something shifting deeper in, retreating from the light. I floored it. The service road narrowed almost immediately, trees crowding close enough that branches scraped along the sides of the van with shrill, nails-on-metal shrieks. The road twisted unpredictably, rutted, and half swallowed by roots. I'd driven worse. I told myself that. I told myself a lot of things to keep from looking in the mirrors. The crying followed me. It didn't fade with distance. It matched my speed, rising and falling like it was being carried just beyond the reach of my headlights. Sometimes it sounded like a woman, sometimes like a child. Once, just once, it sounded like it was right behind me, breath hitching between sobs. My radio crackled to life on its own. Static at first, then a voice bleeding through in fragments. Don't stop. Road ends. Keep going. I slapped the dash, heart pounding, and the sound cut out. The silence that followed was worse. Too clean. Too intentional. The forest began to change. The trees thinned, then pressed back in, then thinned again, as if the road was looping in on itself. My GPS spun uselessly, the map refusing to orient. I recognized nothing, not the bend I'd taken, not the fallen log half blocking the path, not the wooden sign that flashed past my headlights too quickly to read. Then the engine sputtered. No, I said out loud, my voice sounding small in the cab. I eased off the gas, coaxing it, whispering promises I didn't believe. The van shuddered, coughed, and died. Momentum carried me forward a few more feet before we rolled to a stop. The crying stopped. I sat there in the sudden stillness, hands locked on the steering wheel, listening to my own pulse thud in my ears. The forest pressed in close, every sound amplified by the absence of the engine. I tried the ignition again. Nothing. Not even a click. From somewhere ahead, a branch snapped. Then another. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through undergrowth coming from the road in front of me. I turned off the headlights without thinking, plunging myself into darkness broken only by moonlight filtering through the canopy. I could see them then. Shapes moving between the trees. Not rushing, not hiding, just walking. 3 of them, maybe 4. Tall. Wrongly proportioned, arms hanging too long, heads tilted at angles that made my eyes ache to follow. They stopped at the edge of the road just beyond the reach of the van. One stepped forward. The smell hit me again. Wet fur, iron, something old and rotting. My throat burned as I swallowed back bile. I fumbled for my phone, hands numb, screen glaring too bright in the dark. No signal, no emergency calls, nothing. The figure raised an arm. It knocked once, softly on the hood. I screamed. The sound tore out of me, raw and uncontrolled, shattering the quiet. The figure flinched. Not away, but closer, as if the noise had drawn it in. The others shifted, their movements out of sync, like puppets pulled by different strings. Something slammed into the side of the van, hard enough to rock it. Then another impact from the rear. Metal groaned. Glass rattled. I scrambled into the back, heart hammering, grabbing the emergency flare from under the bench seat. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped it. I struck it against the floor. Red light flared to life, bathing the interior in a violent glow. Outside, the shapes recoiled. They didn't run. They didn't flee. They just retreated, stepping back into the trees, faces, or what passed for faces, turning away from the light like it hurt to look at. The pressure against the van eased. The metal stopped screaming. I didn't waste the moment. I popped the hood release, jumped out, flare held high, and ran to the front. The night air felt thick, hard to breathe, every shadow twitching with imagined movement. I slammed the hood shut harder than necessary, then ran back to the driver's seat. The engine turned over on the first try. I didn't question it. I drove. The road straightened suddenly, gravel giving way to pavement so abruptly it felt like crossing a boundary. The forest thinned, then fell away entirely, replaced by open sky and the distant glow of town lights. I didn't slow until I saw a gas station, bright and ordinary and blessedly human. I parked under the lights and sat there, shaking, the flare burning out in the dirt beside the pump. When I finally stepped out, my legs nearly gave way. A man inside the station watched me through the glass, concern creasing his brow. He came out, asked if I was okay. I tried to explain. The campground, the other van, the crying, the things in the trees. The words sounded ridiculous even as they left my mouth. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "You're not the first," he said. "People go missing up there. Cars found abandoned, campsites left like everyone just walked off." I asked him if he'd heard about a beige Volkswagen van. His expression tightened. "A few years back," he said. "Family camping. Never found them. Van was there. Everything else gone." I slept in my van that night, parked under fluorescent lights, every sound making me flinch. In the morning, I drove home without stopping, the forest shrinking in my mirrors. I sold the Vanagon a month later. I still camp, but I don't chase solitude anymore. I don't ignore my instincts, and when a forest goes quiet around me, I leave. No questions asked. Some places aren't meant to be understood. They're meant to be escaped. I thought leaving that night would end it. I believed distance would turn the memory into something manageable, a story with sharp edges dulled by time. That was my mistake. Some experiences don't stay where they happen. They follow you quietly, changing the way you listen, the way you trust silence, the way you decide where it's safe to rest. For weeks after I got home, I slept with the lights on, not because I expected something to come for me, but because darkness had stopped feeling neutral. It felt observant, like a held breath. I replayed the night over and over, searching for the point where I should have turned back. The moment the forest went quiet, the second camper vanished without a word. The knocking, the crying, the beige Volkswagen sitting there like a closed eye. I kept asking myself why I hadn't gone to check on them earlier before fear took over. The answer, when it finally came, wasn't comforting, because I already knew something was wrong, and part of me understood that getting closer would not have helped them, or me. A week later, I called the local ranger district. I didn't give them theories. I didn't talk about shapes or voices. I described what I could prove: the abandoned campground, the open van, the unexplained departure of other campers. The woman on the phone went quiet for a long moment, then asked me to spell the road name twice. "That area isn't listed as an active campground," she said finally. "It was closed years ago." I asked her why there were still fire rings, why people were still finding it. She didn't answer directly. "We've put up signs," she said. "They don't stay up." When I told her about the knocking, about the crying, about the way the forest seemed to move around the road, she didn't laugh. She didn't tell me I was mistaken. She only said, "You did the right thing by leaving." That sentence sat heavier than any explanation. Months passed. Life resumed its shape. Work filled my days. Friends checked in. The world continued to be ordinary in the way it always is when you're not looking too closely. But camping was different now. Every trip came with rules I hadn't needed before. I don't camp alone anymore. I don't stay where there's no record, no ranger, no signal. I don't ignore the behavior of other campers. Fear spreads for a reason. And I never, ever stay when the forest goes quiet. Because silence isn't peace, not out there. Silence is attention. I learned that the hard way when, nearly a year later, I saw the van again. It was parked at a rest stop off a highway in Northern California. Beige, same model, same dent above the rear wheel well, curtains drawn. My hands went cold on the steering wheel as I slowed, heart racing, telling myself it was coincidence. Volkswagen vans are common, beige ones even more so. But this one had something I recognized immediately. A smear on the rear door, dark, hand-shaped, right where something had knocked from the inside. I didn't stop. I drove past and kept driving, pulse roaring in my ears. 10 miles later, I pulled over, shaking, and checked myself for the first time since that night, not physically, but mentally. I realized then that what haunted me wasn't just what I'd seen, it was what I'd escaped. People talk about disappearances like they're sudden, violent, obvious. But the truth is quieter. People vanish because something convinces them to step just a little farther from safety, to answer a sound, to open a door, to stay one more night. I think about the family that van belonged to, about the SUV that fled the campground, about the pickup truck that never left while I was there. I wonder if they made it out. I wonder how many didn't. And I think about why Volkswagen campers especially seem drawn to places like that. We romanticize the road, freedom, isolation, the idea that if you drive far enough, you'll find a version of yourself untouched by the noise of the world. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes the quiet doesn't reveal you. Sometimes it reveals what's already there. The forest doesn't need to chase you. It just waits. It lets you come to it, lets you believe you belong. It lets you settle in and lower your guard. And then it listens. It learns your routines, your sounds, your voice. That's what the crying was. Not a lure, not at first. It was practice. I don't tell this story to scare people away from camping. I still believe the road has value. I still believe there's something honest about sleeping with only thin walls between you and the world. But I believe something else now too. Not every place wants you there. Not every silence is empty. And not every knock should be answered. If you camp in a Volkswagen, if you chase old roads and forgotten campgrounds, remember this: you are never as alone as you think. Pay attention to how the land feels, not how it looks. Trust the discomfort that arrives before fear. And when something feels off, leave early. Leave embarrassed. Leave without proof. Because the people who disappear don't usually vanish screaming. They go quietly, and the forest keeps them. I woke up to the sound of my own breath echoing inside the doka, the kind of hollow inhale that makes you realize the night has been awake longer than you have. The pop top above me sighed as a cold gust slid down from the upper peninsula hills, the canvas stretching and relaxing like an old joint testing itself. I lay there, one hand on my chest, the other brushing the cracked vinyl of the bench I had converted into a bed, trying to remember where I was. Porcupine Mountains. A forest road that didn't show up on my phone anymore. Pines stacked so tightly they blocked the moon like a lid. The smell inside the truck was familiar and oddly comforting. Old insulation, faint gasoline, damp wool socks, and that sour-sweet breath of the propane fridge cycling on and off beneath the counter. Home, in other words. I live full-time in a 1986 Volkswagen T3 Doka Custom. Most people see a boxy relic. I see a confession booth on wheels. I'm 39, a construction inspector by trade, which means I make a living pointing out what others missed. Cracks in concrete, load paths that don't make sense, failures that start small and end catastrophic. It's a funny job for someone who spends most nights parked alone in places where mistakes don't get inspected until it's too late. The fridge clicked again. The auxiliary battery groaned under the load, a tired sigh I knew too well. I had pushed it too far that day, letting the interior lights stay on while I cooked, charging tools and my phone from an inverter that whined like a mosquito. Tomorrow I would pay for it with a slow crank or no crank at all. I told myself I'd shut the fridge down soon, but the thought of warm food in the morning kept my hand away from the switch. That was when I heard it. Not a sound exactly. More like the absence of one. The forest had been humming, insects ticking like static, a distant wind moving through needles. Then it all cut out, as if someone had leaned over the world and pressed mute. My eyes opened. I listened. The doka settled on its leaf springs, a tiny metallic tick from the cooling exhaust. Somewhere far off, water moved. Lake Superior breathing in the dark. I held still long enough that my back started to ache, the old injury from years ago reminding me that I wasn't 20 anymore. Then came the scrape. It was soft, tentative, right under the cab, not a branch, not wind. It had rhythm, a drag, then a pause, another drag like something being pulled along the gravel. I slid my hand down and wrapped my fingers around the flashlight I kept wedged between the seat and the door. The sliding door, I should say. It had been temperamental since Minnesota. The track bent just enough that it liked to stick halfway open if you didn't coax it. I imagined trying to escape in a hurry, yanking on it while panic climbed my throat, and forced myself to breathe slow. Another scrape. Closer now, almost directly beneath my feet. I sat up, careful not to rock the truck. The pop-top creaked in protest, a long wooden groan that sounded louder than it should have in the silence. I froze, waiting to see if whoever or whatever was out there would react. Nothing. I leaned forward and peered through the narrow gap in the curtain over the side window. Darkness pressed back. My own reflection stared at me, eyes too bright, face older than I remembered. For a moment, another memory slipped in uninvited. Headlights. Rain on asphalt. A shape in the road that wasn't a shape until it was too late. I shut that door in my mind hard. Not tonight. The scrape stopped. I counted my breaths. 1, 2, 3. Then I saw them. At first, my brain refused to label what I was looking at. Just pale shapes on dark gravel, barely visible in the beam of my flashlight as I angled it down through the glass. They were directly beneath the side mirror, clustered near the rear wheel. Long ovals with toes, 5 of them pressed into the wet dirt like a stamp. Barefoot. They led from the tree line straight to my truck and then vanished. No prints leading away. No tracks circling, just those wet impressions, glistening as if they had been made seconds ago. A shiver ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold. I had camped all over the country. Desert BLM land where you can see headlights from 10 miles away. Appalachian hollers where locals mind their own business but always know you're there. I had dealt with curiosity, with drunks, with the occasional aggressive knock from someone who didn't like outsiders. This was different. There was intimacy in those prints. A choice to approach quietly, to come barefoot through cold, damp forest floor, to stand inches from my door. The propane fridge kicked off, the sudden silence inside the cabin almost as loud as the scrape had been. I cursed under my breath and twisted the control knob until it stayed off. The battery indicator flickered, then steadied. Outside, something shifted. I couldn't see it, but I felt it the way you feel someone step closer behind you in line. The hair on my arms lifted. Morgan, I whispered to myself, the sound of my own name grounding me. Think. My first instinct was to turn the key and fire the engine. The Wasserboxer was finicky when cold, but she'd usually catch if I feathered the throttle just right. The problem was the noise. Once I committed, there would be no pretending I was asleep. No ambiguity. Another footprint appeared. It wasn't there a second ago, I was sure of it. The dirt was disturbed anew, darker than the others, the edges crisp. Whoever was out there was still moving, placing their weight carefully, silently. I felt dread settle into my stomach like wet cement. The kind that doesn't spike your heart rate right away but drags it down, heavy and slow. Hey, I called, my voice steadier than I felt. You're too close to my vehicle. The words sounded thin as they hit the glass and died. No answer. Instead, a handprint bloomed on the side panel beneath the window. 5 fingers smeared slightly, leaving a trail of mud that slid down the faded blue paint. I stared at it, my mind doing something strange and clinical, noting the size, the spacing, the way the thumb angled inward. Adult, strong, familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. The past slammed into me then, hard enough to steal my breath, rain streaking the windshield. The thump that I told myself was a deer. The way I didn't stop. The way I kept driving until the shaking stopped and the road swallowed the sound behind me. I had inspected bridges for cracks smaller than a fingernail and missed the biggest fracture in my own life. Another scrape. Right at the front now. I lunged forward and flicked the headlight switch. The relays clicked, the bulbs flared, and the forest leapt into existence in stark yellow. Trees. Ferns, steam rising from the damp ground, and the footprints, Dozens of them now, surrounding the doka like a slow tide, all barefoot, all pointing inward. No people. My pulse hammered. Panic climbed, hot and fast, chasing the calm dread away. I fumbled the key into the ignition, my fingers slick. The battery whined as I turned it, the starter grinding once, twice. Come on. Come on. The engine coughed, then caught, the familiar, uneven idle a rough comfort. The smell of exhaust curled back through a crack in the window, oily and sharp. I slammed the lights to high beam and scanned again. Still nothing. But as I pulled my foot to the clutch and jammed it into gear, I saw one last thing in the mirror. A single wet footprint, perfectly centered behind me on the gravel, slowly filling with water as the rain began to fall. I didn't look back as I rolled forward, the sliding door rattling in its track, the forest closing in on both sides. I drove until the road smoothed and my hands stopped shaking, the engine's rhythm slowly pulling me back from the edge. I told myself it was a trick of light, locals messing with a lone camper, anything but what my gut insisted on. By the time I reached Pictured Rocks days later, I had almost convinced myself it was over. I was wrong. The rain followed me east like a quiet accusation, misting the cliffs at Pictured Rocks and soaking into every seam of the doka. I parked at a small pullout overlooking Lake Superior, the kind with a wooden rail half-rotted and a view that makes you forget the road behind you. The lake was steel gray, breathing slow. I told myself water had rules. Forests could hide things. Water laid everything out in the open. I shut the engine down and listened to it tick itself cool. The smell inside shifted as the heat faded, trading exhaust for damp canvas and old coffee grounds. My boots squelched when I stepped out, and for a second I hesitated, looking down at my feet. I hated that I noticed. Hated that I checked the ground first instead of the horizon. The prints were gone here. Rock and sand didn't hold secrets the way soil did. I exhaled and forced my shoulders down. You're tired, I told myself. You drove too long. You're carrying things you shouldn't. The lake wind pushed at the pop top, making it thrum like a low drum. I popped it anyway, the hinges complaining, the fabric snapping tight. Home mode. Normal. I cooked on the little propane burner, listening to the fridge cycle again after I turned it back on, a calculated risk with the battery. The flame hissed. Pasta boiled. I ate standing up, watching fog curl along the water like smoke that couldn't quite decide to leave. Somewhere behind me, the forest whispered, but I kept my eyes on the lake until the sky went fully dark. Sleep came in shallow waves. I dreamed of inspections, of walking a bridge at night with a flashlight that kept flickering out, of footprints in concrete that never dried. Each time I jerked awake, the doka answered with its own noises. A panel ticking, the sliding door shifting as the temperature dropped. Once I thought I heard the scrape again, but it was only a branch tapping the bumper in the wind. Near midnight, the fridge shut off. Silence settled hard. I lay there staring up at the canvas ceiling, counting the seconds between waves hitting rock. That was when the smell changed. It was subtle. Dampness layered with something else. A mineral tang like wet stone threaded with something sour. My nose wrinkled before my brain caught up. Blood has a smell when it's old and diluted by rain. I knew that from work sites, from accidents you arrive at after the fact when the story's already written and all you can do is read the margins. I sat up slowly. The smell was strongest near the front by the cab. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and put my feet down. Cold bit through my socks. I hadn't taken my boots off. My heart thudded once, hard. I lifted my feet and stared. The socks were wet, darkened from the toes back, not with rain, with something thicker. No, I breathed. I reached for the flashlight and swept it across the floor. Wet prints marked the rubber mat, leading from the passenger door toward the bed. Barefoot, fresh, each one perfect, the ridges visible in the beam. My mouth went dry. The smell surged, undeniable now. I followed the trail with the light, my hand shaking. The passenger door was still locked. I checked it anyway, fingers numb, solid. A drip fell from above, landing between my feet with a soft, obscene sound. I tilted the flashlight up. There, smeared along the inside of the pop-top fabric, were handprints, dark, glossy, sliding slowly downward as gravity did its work. Whoever had touched the outside canvas had pressed hard enough to force something through. The thought of hands exploring the roof while I slept inches below made my stomach lurch. Panic snapped tight. I fumbled for the keys, my mind screaming to get out, to run, to leave this box. But the prints on the floor were barefoot. I looked at my boots by the door. Clean. Untouched. Someone had been inside with me. The engine protested when I turned the key, the battery dipping low. The dash lights flickered like tired eyes. Come on, I whispered, not to the truck, but to myself. The starter dragged, then caught the rougher than before. I shoved the sliding door open and it stuck, just like I'd imagined, halfway along the track. I slammed my shoulder into it, skinning my arm, and it gave with a shriek of metal. Cold air rushed in, sharp and clean. I jumped down, boots slapping wet gravel, and ran around the back. The ground there was sand and stone. No prints, nothing. I shone the light into the trees, my breath fogging. "Show yourself," I shouted, the words cracking. Only the lake answered. I drove again. Too fast. Headlights tunneling through fog. The Doka shuddered at speed, steering loose, but I didn't slow until the road spit me back onto pavement and the trees thinned into shapes I recognized. A small campground near Munising, lights on, other vehicles parked, people, noise. Safety, even if it was thin. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I scrubbed the floor with water and a rag until my hands ached, the smell fading but not disappearing. The handprints on the canvas soaked through and left shadows that wouldn't wash out. Evidence that didn't care what I told myself. Morning brought sun and tourists and the normal sounds of life. I walked down to the water with a cup of burnt coffee and watched families point at the cliffs. I tried to slot myself back into the world. It didn't quite fit. I thought about calling someone, the police, a friend, anyone. Each option stalled against the same wall. What would I say? Someone left footprints in my truck. Someone touched my roof. Someone smelled like the thing I'd been running from for years. The hit and run had been in Michigan too. Different road, different rain, same state lines on the map that didn't mean anything when you were alone in the dark. I had never told anyone, not the cops, not my family. I told myself there was nothing to tell, no proof, no body, just a sound and a decision and a life that bent around it afterward. That afternoon, I checked the Doka inch by inch, under seats, in cabinets. I found nothing out of place except a small smear on the inside of the passenger window, at shoulder height, like someone had leaned there to look out. I left Pictured Rocks before dusk, heading inland, aiming for the Porcupine Mountains again, despite myself. The road wound back through familiar forest, the trees closing in like a held breath. I told myself patterns end when you break them, that I was in control. The last campsite was empty, a clearing near a creek, the sound of water a constant reassurance. I parked with the nose out, keys ready. The pop-top stayed down. I ate cold food. The fridge stayed off. I sat in the dark and listened. Hours passed. My nerves settled into a brittle calm. Maybe this was it. Maybe whatever had followed me had lost interest, satisfied with the fear it had already carved out. The scrape came just after midnight, right under the cab. I didn't jump this time. I closed my eyes. The dread returned, heavier now because it was expected. I turned the flashlight on without looking and aimed it down through the windshield. Wet, barefoot footprints emerged from under the car, one by one, as if being pressed into existence by an invisible weight. They marched toward the driver's door and stopped. A voice spoke, low and close enough that I felt it in my chest. You didn't stop. Every muscle locked. The forest leaned in. I didn't, I said, the truth falling out of me like something I'd been holding too long. I should have. The silence stretched, then the weight lifted. The prints stopped appearing. Slowly, impossibly, they began to fill with water and fade, the creek's song rising to meet the night again. I stayed until dawn, shaking, alive. I still camp alone. I still sleep in the Doka, but I park where I can see my tracks in the morning. I manage my battery. I fix the sliding door. I don't ignore small signs anymore. Out there, The ground remembers what you try to forget. And if you leave something behind in the dark, it knows how to walk it back to you.